They promise to educate, but here's how history textbooks mislead us. Stop, right now, and think about everything you learned in history class. The dates, the heroes, the villains, the big moments that shaped our world. Now what if I told you that a huge chunk of it was either completely wrong, twisted to fit a narrative, or just straight up left out on purpose? History textbooks aren't just books full of facts. They're propaganda tools that have been shaping how millions of people see the world for generations. And today, we're going to tear apart some of the biggest lies you were taught in school. Because the truth, it's way more complicated and honestly way more interesting than what they told you. Let's start with something basic. Christopher Columbus, the guy who discovered America. Right, the brave explorer who sailed across the ocean blue in 1492. Except here's the thing. Columbus didn't discover anything. There were already millions of people living in the Americas. The Vikings had been there centuries before him, and Columbus himself never even set foot in North America. But that's not even the worst part. What your textbook probably didn't tell you is that Columbus was directly responsible for the genocide and enslavement of indigenous people in the Caribbean. He forced native populations to mine for gold under brutal conditions. If they didn't meet their quota, he had their hands cut off. Entire villages were wiped out. The population of the Tano people went from hundreds of thousands to practically extinct within decades. Yet somehow, for years, American schools taught about Columbus Day like he was some kind of hero. They focused on his courage and determination while glossing over the mass murder and slavery. Why would textbooks do this? Simple. Creating national heroes helps build a sense of pride and identity. It's easier to teach kids about a brave explorer than to explain the dark reality of colonization. But it gets worse. Let's talk about the American Revolution. You know the story. Brave colonists fighting for freedom against the tyrannical British Empire. Liberty and justice for all. Right? Well, not exactly. Your textbook probably didn't spend much time explaining that many of the founding fathers were slave owners who didn't see the irony in fighting for freedom while keeping human beings in chains. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," while owning over 600 enslaved people throughout his lifetime. George Washington owned more than 300. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves for much of his life. The Declaration of Independence, that talks about unalienable rights, it didn't apply to black people, Native Americans, or women. Freedom in America was only for white men with property. And here's something really messed up. One of the reasons some colonists wanted independence was because Britain was starting to limit the expansion into Native American territories. The colonists wanted the freedom to take more land. Your history book probably made the revolution sound like this pure fight for democracy, but the reality is way more complicated and way less inspiring. Speaking of things textbooks skip over, let's talk about World War II. Now obviously, this was a massive conflict with millions of stories, but American textbooks have a very specific way of telling it. They focus heavily on D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and the liberation of concentration camps. America comes in, saves the day, defeats the Nazis. End of story. But here's what gets left out. The Soviet Union lost more people in World War II than any other country. Arhund, 27 million Soviet citizens died. That's more than 15 times the number of American and British deaths combined. The Eastern Front was where the majority of the war was actually fought. The Soviets were pushing back the Nazis long before D-Day happened. But American textbooks barely mention this because during the Cold War, it didn't fit the narrative to give the Soviets credit. And let's not forget that before Pearl Harbor, American companies were doing business with Nazi Germany. IBM provided technology that helped the Nazis track Jewish populations. Ford and General Motors had factories in Germany that built vehicles for the German military. Your textbook probably didn't mention that American eugenics programs actually inspired some of Hitler's racial policies, or that the United States turned away Jewish refugees who were fleeing the Holocaust. These aren't small details. These are huge parts of the story that completely change how we understand this period. But they make America look bad, so they get minimized or cut out entirely. Let's move to something that affects how we see an entire group of people. The Vikings. When you think of Vikings, you probably picture brutal warriors with horned helmets, raiding and pillaging villages across Europe. Here's the truth. Vikings never wore horned helmets. That's a complete myth that started in the 1800s when artists started painting them that way. Horned helmets would have been terrible in combat. But more importantly, Vikings weren't just raiders. They were traders, explorers, farmers, and craftspeople. They had a complex legal system, a rich cultural tradition, and they actually practiced a form of democracy in their assemblies. Viking women had way more rights than women in most of medieval Europe. They could own property, get divorced, and run businesses. Some even became warriors and leaders. But textbooks focus almost entirely on the raiding and violence, because that makes for a simpler, more dramatic story. It's easier to teach about barbarians than to explain a complex culture. This same thing happens with countless other groups throughout history. Complex civilizations get reduced to simple stereotypes because that's easier to test on a multiple-choice exam. Let's talk about something that directly affects how Americans see themselves. Thanksgiving. The story you learned in elementary school probably went something like this. The Pilgrims arrived in America, struggled to survive, and then the friendly Native Americans taught them how to farm and live in this new land. They all sat down together for a big feast to celebrate friendship and cooperation. Happy ending. Except that's not what happened. The Wampanoag people did help the Pilgrims survive. That part is true, but the peaceful relationship didn't last. Within a generation, the colonists were waging war against the Native Americans, taking their land and killing them in massive numbers. King Philip's War in the 1670s was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population size. After one particular massacre of Native Americans, the colonists actually held a celebration feast. Some historians believe this is closer to the real origin of Thanksgiving as a holiday. The Wampanoag leader's head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. This is the same group of people who supposedly had that friendly first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims. But schools teach the sanitized version because it's a nice story that makes everyone feel good. It lets us avoid talking about the genocide that actually happened. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Textbooks don't just lie by what they include. They lie by what they leave out. For example, most American students learn about the Civil Rights Movement. They learn about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. They learn about the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech, but they learn almost nothing about Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, or the more radical elements of the movement. They don't learn that the FBI was actively working to destroy the movement from within. They don't learn that Martin Luther King Jr. was considered a dangerous radical by most white Americans at the time. The sanitized version they teach makes it seem like everyone eventually agreed that civil rights were good and everything worked out. They skip over the fact that MLK was assassinated, that the government conducted illegal surveillance on activists, that the Civil Rights Act didn't magically end racism or inequality. By teaching only the comfortable parts, textbooks create this false idea that progress is inevitable and peaceful. They don't prepare students for the reality that change requires struggle and sacrifice. Let's go international for a second. How much did your textbook teach you about the rest of the world? Probably not much. Right. Most American history textbooks are incredibly U.S.-centric. World history gets crammed into a few chapters, usually focusing on how other countries affected America. You might learn about the French Revolution, but probably not about the Haitian Revolution. Even though it was the only successful slave revolt in history and had huge implications for the entire Western Hemisphere, you probably didn't learn much about the Momo uprising in Kenya, or how brutal British colonial rule was across Africa and Asia. You might not have heard about the Bengal famine that killed millions while Britain was exporting food from India, the Opium Wars, where Britain literally forced China to accept drug imports. Probably not in your textbook, the U.S. overthrow of democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and dozens of other countries. Maybe a footnote if you're lucky. This isn't an accident. By keeping the focus on America and Europe, textbooks reinforce the idea that the West is the center of the world and the rest of the globe is just background noise. Even when textbooks do cover non-Western history, they often do it through a Western lens. They talk about these places being discovered by Europeans, as if they didn't exist before white people showed up. Ancient African kingdoms, Asian empires, indigenous American civilizations. All of these had rich histories and incredible achievements, but they get reduced to a paragraph or two while European history gets entire chapters. Here's another big one. The Industrial Revolution. Your textbook probably taught you about innovation, progress, new inventions, and economic growth. The steam engine, the factory system, new manufacturing techniques. What they probably didn't emphasize was the human cost. Children as young as 5 or 6 working in factories and mines. People working 16-hour days, in dangerous conditions for poverty wages. Workers getting injured or killed because there were no safety regulations. Entire communities destroyed by pollution. Cities filled with disease because of overcrowding and poor sanitation. Labor movements where workers were beaten and killed for trying to organize unions. The government and business owners using violence to suppress anyone who demanded better conditions. The wealth and progress of the Industrial Revolution was built on the exploitation and suffering of millions of working-class people, but textbooks present it as this neutral march of progress. Same thing with the expansion of the American West. Textbooks call it Manifest Destiny and talk about pioneers and opportunity. They mention conflicts with Native Americans, but usually frame it as inevitable or even natural. What really happened was systematic genocide. The U.S. government and military deliberately destroyed Native American food sources, forced people off their land, broke every treaty they signed, and killed anyone who resisted. The Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee people were forced to march hundreds of miles, dying along the way. The Sand Creek Massacre, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women and children. The near extinction of buffalo herds, which was done specifically to destroy the way of life for Plains tribes. The forcing of children into boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their own languages. This wasn't just conflict. It was deliberate cultural destruction and mass murder. But calling it westward expansion sounds so much nicer in a textbook. Let's talk about something more recent, the Cold War. American textbooks teach this as a battle between freedom and communism, democracy versus totalitarianism. And sure, the Soviet Union did plenty of terrible things, but American textbooks conveniently leave out the terrible things the U.S. did in the name of fighting communism. Supporting dictators who murdered their own people as long as they were anti-communist, overthrowing democratic governments, and installing brutal military regimes, supporting death squads in Central and South America. The Vietnam War gets taught as this tragic mistake, but textbooks often skip over the full extent of the destruction. The U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than were used in all of World War II. Agent Orange poisoned millions of people and is still causing birth defects today. Entire villages were massacred. The My Lai massacre, where American soldiers killed over 500 civilians, gets mentioned, but it's presented as an isolated incident when similar events happened throughout the war. And after all that death and destruction, the U.S. lost anyway. But textbooks frame it as noble intentions gone wrong, rather than an unjust war that should never have been fought. Here's the thing that really bothers me. These aren't just historical curiosities or interesting facts that got left out. These lies and omissions shape how people see the world today. When you learn a sanitized version of history, where your country is always the hero, it makes it harder to recognize when your country is doing something wrong in the present. If you never learned about past government lies and propaganda, you're more likely to trust what the government says now. If you never learned about how movements for change were violently opposed, you might not understand why protests still happen today. History textbooks create a narrative where progress is linear, where things always get better, where the good guys always win eventually. Real history is messier and more complicated than that. And the craziest part, different states in America have different standards for what goes in textbooks. Texas and California are huge markets, so textbook publishers often write books specifically for those states. That means kids in different parts of the country are literally learning different versions of history. Some textbooks call enslaved people workers or immigrants to avoid talking about slavery directly. Some textbooks downplay climate change, or other scientific facts, because certain political groups don't like them. The line between history and politics gets really blurred. Publishers also simplify things to make sure textbooks can be approved by state education boards. This means dumbing down complex topics and avoiding anything controversial. The result is boring, oversimplified books that don't prepare students for the real world. No wonder so many people find history class boring. They're not actually learning history. So what can you do about this? First, understand that your textbook was never the full story. It was one version of history, filtered through multiple political and commercial interests. Second, seek out other perspectives. Read books by historians from different backgrounds. Learn about events from the perspective of the people who lived through them, not just the people who won. Third, ask questions. When you hear a historical claim, ask who benefits from that narrative. What's being left out? Who's telling this story, and why? History is not a list of facts and dates. It's an ongoing argument about what happened and what it means. Every historical account is shaped by the person telling it and the time they're living in. The histories we tell ourselves matter because they shape how we see ourselves and our place in the world. They influence what we think is possible and what we think is right. When textbooks lie or oversimplify, they're not just failing to educate, they're actively shaping young minds to accept certain ideas about power, justice, and how the world works. The good news is that we're living in a time where information is more accessible than ever. You can fact-check claims, read primary sources, hear from voices that used to be silenced. You don't have to accept the version of history you were taught in school. You can dig deeper, ask harder questions, and build a more complete understanding of the past. Because here's the truth they don't want you to realize. History isn't written by the winners. History is written by the people who write the textbooks. And for too long, those people have had their own agendas. Understanding how we've been misled about the past is the first step to thinking more critically about the present. Once you see how narratives are constructed and controlled, you can't unsee it. Every country does this to some degree. Every culture has myths and legends that get taught as history. But recognizing that fact doesn't mean giving up on truth. It means acknowledging that history is complicated, that there are always multiple perspectives, and that we need to be humble about what we think we know. The textbook version of history is designed to make you feel good about your country and accept the status quo. Real history should make you think, question, and maybe feel a little uncomfortable, because the past was messy and brutal, and full of people making terrible decisions, but it was also full of people fighting for justice, resisting oppression, and trying to make things better. Those stories of resistance and struggle often get left out because they're inconvenient. They show that ordinary people have power when they organize and fight back. That's a dangerous lesson for textbooks to teach. Much safer to present history as something that just happens, shaped by great men and inevitable forces, rather than by the actions of regular people. But the truth is that history has always been made by people, and that means we're making history right now, whether we realize it or not. The choices we make, the systems we accept or challenge, the stories we tell about who we are, all of this becomes the history that future generations will learn or unlearn. So the next time someone confidently states a historical fact, remember that they probably learned it from a textbook with an agenda. And maybe, just maybe, there's a lot more to the story. If this opened your eyes to how much you were lied to in school, subscribe for more videos like this.